Um, what would you say is like the biggest like difference so far from like coaching, because you coach in the CrossFit space, like between that and what you've learned here and all that kind of stuff? Like, what's the contrast, this different community and all that?
I think I've learned the most about feeling here and
Yeah.
not just looks and position. I've
Oh,
actually
yeah.
learned how to like feel the movements that I'm doing and going.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would, when I started doing like this type of work, the first time I ever felt like when I did like a rope pull or something like that, the amount of pain that I was in, I was like, how come I never felt that
Right.
before? And then while I was doing it, I was like, this effing sucks, right?
Yeah.
But then afterwards, I was like, wait a second. Like, that feels kind of
Good.
good,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
painful during, but after the recovery process after was like, wait a second, give me some more of that, because my shoulders the next day felt like I had new shoulders.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny.
That's what I've experienced.
Yeah.
For sure.
So we'll get into that stuff when we do the movement stuff. So yeah. So you want to intro us
All
then?
right. Welcome to Special Fit. I'm Kennedy and I'm here with Coach Mike.
Hello.
And today we're filming a video.
We're gonna talk about movement, right? To me, the reason why I wanted to start with this conversation first is that I think there's like a big misdefinition of movement, right? Like, I think that maybe from like the CrossFit standpoint, we got really close, which probably a lot of what we'll talk about today may even kind of go in line with a lot of that stuff. But then I think there's like some things that are kind of missing. So we were just talking about, feeling and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of times what happens is we take concepts, and like concepts to me are like systems. You know what I mean? And it's like, you could take a system, but then who messes the system up?
We do.
The people do, right? So it's like Glassman did a really good job of like, hey, functional movements, all that whole thing, he has this formula, but then the coaches get a hold of it and it's like, oh yeah, well, I'm gonna make the recipe, you know what I mean?
Right.
I'm gonna add a little bit of this to it,
Yeah.
And I think that kind of goes with that whole concept of objectives versus constraints. It's like you look at the concepts and you're like, oh yeah, but now I'm gonna add and add and add and add. And then at a certain point, it's like with all things, like you can keep doing that and it's gonna work until it doesn't work. You know what I mean? It's like you can, and Tyler says this all the time. I love it when he says it, because where does that end? You know what I mean? It's like, okay, go heavier, go heavier, go heavier, linear progression. It's like, it doesn't always work that way. What if the way to get from 200-pound squat to 300-pound squat is not the same as 300 to 400 and 400 to 500, right? Because I don't think I've ever actually seen somebody use the same thing every time and get and continue, because otherwise it would just keep going, right?
You never hit plateaus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'll hear it like Olympic lifters or bodybuilders or like power lifters and stuff like that. You'll hear them say things like, in the beginning, the returns are great, but then as you hit wherever your real center is, then the PRs are not as big, right? You get maybe a 5-pound PR and you're like happy with that. So where, I guess, do we draw that line of like that linear progression working? At a certain point it doesn't.
Right.
And then what?
Right. Plateau for a long time.
Plateau for a long time. You sit at the same number, or you even go backwards.
Yeah.
Because then you get hurt.
Yeah.
So that works like that in I think in the I guess the neuro majority. But then I think, like, how does this linear progression or objectives versus constraints, all this stuff, how does this work, let's say, on, with the neurodiverse community? Because if we're thinking about you know, getting stronger or more endurance or whatever it might be, getting healthier, more fit, all of that stuff, we still need to create change through adaptation and all of that stuff. But we got all these other factors we have to deal with, right? So you have like the behavioral factors, you have the anything that would be like a comorbidity of whatever the diagnosis might be. So it could be physiological, it could be neurological, or just as an individual differences, right? We all have our preferences, our likes, dislikes, and all of that stuff. Like we had to take all of that stuff into account, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think like the neuro truck passing by. We're always gonna get background noise because people always working out. There's
Unavoidable.
hopefully the music, Facebook or whatever won't be like, hey.
No ads.
But we're all new to this, so it's all good. It's all good. Yeah, so there's so many variables. Like, how do we get like students who have these different types of challenges to get the types of returns on movement? You know, so I think that the conversation first has to start with like, how do we define movement, right? So I think that Julian does probably the best job of that in terms of looking at what human movement is and actually thinking about the difference between human movement as a principle and then how does that change with exercise, and then what is like the actual movement pattern supposed to be, right? So I drew up his things just so that we have it for reference here, but basically you have, you know, 4 corners of the box. This is your movement box. The circle represents you as the individual, and that circle is basically the relationship between homeostasis and hormesis, which would be good stress versus balance, right? So what we're after is critical mass, which is basically the tension coming from both sides. So if we drew that as like an arch, right? And you have homeostasis on one side and then hormesis on this side, the tension coming from here to there, right, is basically critical mass. So that's basically like your result of it. So just from in terms of concepts, you have human movement, you have load, hold, and carry. That's basically the body is super complex. Like we can never really take the body and make it just fit into everything like this nicely, because in terms of exercise, what we do, it does explain a lot of it, is that you're either loading, squat, hinge, push, pull, right? So basically your feet are stationary. You know, you're not moving anywhere, you're just planted and you're squatting or you're bench pressing, right? You're doing ring rows, or this could be, even though your feet are in the air, pull-ups, but you're basically staying in one place. Holding, which would now you're bracing or balancing or holding in an isometric contraction. So if I'm grabbing the object or if I'm squeezing the object, so if I'm riding a horse, I'm squeezing it with my legs, or it involves balance in some way, right? And then carrying is like locomotion, so you're taking that object and moving it. So as human beings, we do all of this, you know what I mean? So it kind of pretty much sums up what we do as human beings. And then planes of movement, sagittal plane up and down, frontal plane forward and backward, transverse would be rotation, and then medial right and left, right? Energy systems, and I'm going through this really quickly because Julian has a video that explains this way more into depth. So we will put that video into the show notes here so that you can reference that. We're always taking the concepts that we get from StrongFit and Julian and his team and try to adapt it to our community, because we work closely with them, and Julian's helping us a lot with a lot of these things that we're putting together, and we feel that the concepts that we're gathering from there have really moved the needle for us and as a community. So I'm just going through them really quickly, but the video for that one will be in the show notes. So muscle endurance and endurance are basically the aerobic system. Strength endurance and strength overall will be the anaerobic system. So you're going from, creatine phosphate to lactate production and consumption, and then the usage or fats would be down here in the usage or consumption of lactate. Then muscle contraction, concentric, eccentric, isometric, so, which is one of the areas that I first wanted to talk about, was that when I look at a lot of our students, I see them mostly struggle. So if I were to go around the box, we can kind of make a generalization of like, where do we see and why do we see these patterns occurring? So eccentric and isometric seem to be a big issue for a couple of reasons. One being that you have to control the weight here. So whenever you are in an eccentric, so let's say if you're squatting, or let's talk about a bicep curl just because it's easy and we're sitting down. When I pull the dumbbell up and my muscle contracts, it gets shorter, that would be concentric. When I have to guide it down and I have to resist the weight on the way down, that's the eccentric phase. That's the phase that makes you sore. So what you'll see a lot of times is they can do this really well, but then they so they end up swinging the weight, right? So one is because the eccentric part is what's hard. It's the part that where the weight wins, right? Because here the muscle wins, here the weight wins. And then if you're in an isometric contraction, then neither one, and that's actually the strongest contraction. So if you ever sat, if you ever sat at the bottom of a squat for 30 seconds, you know what that feels like. So when I look at those things, and I look at from a general standpoint, and I would almost go at 100% that unless the student has tremendous flexibility, they struggle. They still struggle with it, but they make it look better. So somebody who's very flexible can sit at the bottom of the squat, but they're disengaged. Because they have so much range of motion, they're just down there. They're just passive. So I would say almost every single person struggles with that because it is the hardest thing to do. It sucks for all of us, right? You did the the pec before? Yeah. So when you're holding that thing and you're just starting to shake, we're talking about a pec stick. We have these sticks that, have a lot of tension and you got to squeeze them, and we'll listen to a song and kind of just hold it, and then every time you hear whatever, Halo or My Name Is, whatever it is, you rep it out. But you try to last the full song, but nobody ever does, right?
20, 30 seconds before you break. You're right back into it.
Yeah, so that's what's really hard. And I think if we were going to build strength, it's one of those things where from a programming standpoint, it's hard to think about like, where do we start first? Do we do this? Or do we start here and build structure and then go, you know what I mean? So what I really like about what StrongFit does and Julian's programming and how we've kind of worked at this is that I can take somebody and who's limited in their motor planning or just motor function altogether, and I can have them push a box across the turf, right, or drag the sled backwards, or pull on the ropes to a certain extent if they have a grip, and then, or they can, we have the yokes that we made up with the PVC, right? They can hold it on their back and walk with it, or they could take an object and just walk with it like a sandbag, right? And I can get a response through the concentric and build some structure for the body. But we can do those banded things or the pec walks or this and get some. And it's crazy because when I started doing it, when I started working on the template, I noticed that like I suck at bench. I don't know why, like I just never had a big bench ever. But from doing the pec stuff, all of a sudden like
transferred.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So I guess there's like something to be said about the arch concept when you look at the four corners. And the crazy thing is, this all applies. It just, what I find is that what matters is like, you have to look at the individual and say, what's missing?
Right.
And like, what do you do a lot of or favor? And probably like you're over here on one extreme and you need to train the other extreme, you know? So when I look at this, I'm always like, all right, you know, they can push, but they can't pull. They can somewhat squat, but they can't hinge, right? And, you know, mostly sagittal, very little transverse and frontal plane. So we kind of bias some things there, which is why I love like carries so much, like farmer carries, suitcase carries, things like that, because they work all of that.
Right.
And then in terms of energy systems, you know, mostly this stuff and not a lot of this stuff. So our programming tends to like bias those things, because from a general standpoint, we see that a lot of our kids wear the holes in there. So then when we look at things like anxiety, depressive behaviors, aggression, all of those maladaptive behaviors, we could plug it in and go, now we could look at, say, how the nervous system responds to all this stuff and go, hey, this makes a lot of sense, you know? I think it's just one of those things where we get really confused about what is sport, what is fitness, you know, what is human movement versus what is exercise.
Right.
What's been your like experience with that, like as an athlete? Because you play a sport, right?
Yeah,
you play
I
soccer?
grew up playing softball, soccer, volleyball.
Oh, damn.
So I did it all. Tried everything.
What position you play in soccer?
Center back. I wasn't very good with the ball at my feet, but I could stop a girl from getting past me every time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think a lot of what I did in sport transferred to day-to-day life. Especially when I found CrossFit, I found that I was able to pick it up really quickly because of that. And then simple things like when you go to the grocery store and you have to carry, you know, groceries in from the car, it mirrors, you know, the farmers carry and stuff like that. So I did find that a lot of that stuff was transferable. Yeah.
What about like, did you ever sustain any injuries? Like,
so I never sustained injuries in sport. And the only time I hurt
lucky.
myself, I know.
Especially being a soccer player.
Well, if I felt like my ankles were going to get broken, I wouldn't do it.
Oh.
I would step away, which my coaches didn't appreciate, but I always would protect my body first. But the only time I did injure myself in CrossFit was overtraining. It was, I was training 7 times a week. I was also training for a long run that I was going to do. So I was doing CrossFit every single day, and then I would go run 10, 15 miles on the weekends. And so I thought I was young enough. I thought I could. I didn't really pay attention to necessarily what I was doing. I just did it based on energy levels. So like I felt like I could do it, so I did it instead of how do I feel.
Right.
And so I sustained some injuries from that. But never like doing things wrong. You know, I've had the tweaked back. I've had I probably lifted too heavy and I didn't necessarily have the tension. I just pulled it. So those are probably the only injuries I've experienced from that.
Right on. How long have you been doing CrossFit?
About 5 years, with some breaks here and there. Some longer breaks just because I needed it mentally and I just wasn't in it. So I was like, maybe if I just step away and come back to it.
Right on. That's interesting that as an athlete you weren't really prone to injury, but then you find
I had a dad. My dad was a chiropractor growing up. And then he became a fireman. So because he coached us a lot. So he was very good about, you know, doing the proper movements, the warm-ups, making us work out. He was very good about rest and what we ate really well growing up. So I think compared to a lot of the other kids I played with, especially in like rec ball, you know, when it's not that serious, I think I had a leg up in
Yeah.
in that area, because I did have that experience of, the eating right, training right, proper rest, good sleep habits, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Man, you're lucky then.
I know. I know. My sister, on the other hand, broke an ankle, cracked face,
Oh,
bone.
how'd she crack her face?
Softball that she was
Oh,
going
oh.
to catch, and it went right by her glove.
Oh,
She had,
geez.
she had plenty of injuries.
Oh, geez.
Yes, so I'm the lucky one in the family.
Maybe you weren't going hard enough. No, I'm
Maybe.
just kidding.
That's very possible. I was afraid of hurting myself, so yeah.
Oh man, that's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting because like Special Fit as like an organization for as long as we've been around, still very brand new, in terms
Right.
of applying all of these types of concepts to, and I think one of the reasons, so I was talking to a few parents this morning, and what I was thinking about was, when we think about exercise and then trying to apply it to somebody who has different types of challenges, whether they're sensory needs or, motor function, all that kind of stuff. And then you try to get them to do some type of movement. It doesn't always work out, but
Right.
that doesn't mean this doesn't apply. Because I've worked with students who aren't ambulatory. They either they got some genetic disorder or they have, but when I looked at some of this stuff, I knew that, especially when it came to the human movement patterns, was that we all still go through the same
Yeah.
evolution of how through development, how those movement patterns. So even if they're not there in terms of expression, that they're in there waiting to be expressed, because that's just the way that we're
Right.
built. You know what I
Obviously.
mean? So it's like, hey, maybe that student's not going to be standing up and carrying a sandbag, but if the movement pattern is still squatting, if that's where they are in their development, then that's the next, thing that's there. Maybe some of this stuff might not be ready to be uncovered or whatever because they're not moving that much, but
Right.
doesn't mean that they don't have this system.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the thing that always kind of goes around in my head, is like, these concepts are always, they make a lot of sense, but then how do we adapt the concept and say, okay, I have this kid who mostly lays and maybe rolls around side to side, but they're not deadlifting anytime soon.
Right.
But what about the hinge pattern? What would that look like at this stage? When, and I've learned that it's in there. You just have to find ways to elicit whatever that response might be. So I think that's maybe where we really have to kind of look at things and go, okay, I'm not just going to take the student and go, oh, he can't do this or he can't do that, so we're not even going to touch it.
Right.
Because we see that a lot with like the kids or the students that we work with that are non-speaking. So like we may have therapists or may have people, teachers, educators that are like, well, if I can't communicate with them, then it must mean that he has nothing to say.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I think from a movement standpoint, if we understand the concepts, we will find ways to be forceful enough to bring out things in them.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And how does that work inside the gym? Like specifically with movement, scaling?
Yeah, I think it's like the same kind of deal where you have, it's like what, was it Glassman said or somebody else said, where the needs are the same, but they've just varied by degree or magnitude or things like that. So I guess that's what we're talking about. It's like, okay, we have these energy systems, but how we're impacted is going to be slightly different. So if I have a kid that has some sort of condition, whether they have either a really high buildup of lactate already in the body, then I'm going to have to do something on the opposite end to balance things out and create a better response to stress. But if I have kids who are very on the depressive side, where they can't get going, they have problems with inertia,
Right.
they have problems initiating and sustaining movement, things like that, then we have a different type of issue where we're focusing on getting them right. So that's where things like carries come into place. But let's say that kid doesn't have a grip,
Right.
and I want them to carry. How could I get them to load enough and carry enough to elicit the response I'm looking for, where it's not passive, but it's you know, going? So that's where I think the mindset of like presuming competence or presuming fitness in our is we have to find ways, you know, whether that means you put on a weighted vest or you put on something, you do something to get that stimulus that you're looking for. You know what I mean? And that's what this is about. That's what, you know, us posing questions and people in the resource community go, hey, like this is what we did, try it.
Right.
And then somebody else might go, hey, that worked really well, but I also took it to this, and now look, you know, and then people sharing this, because we could share the concept and maybe some of the what. Like here's what we do in the gym, but not everybody has a gym, not everybody has equipment.
Right.
Like how do we adapt these things to, or modify? So scaling could be one, right? So if your kid or student doesn't have a lot of strength endurance, their modification is less volume or less intensity or whatnot. So scaling is one way, modification of the exercise is another. So if you lack range of motion or you lack you know, the capacity to sequence movements, compounding movements together, things like that, then you look at the stimulus and go, okay, what's the intent of this exercise, right? We had 2 students earlier doing a sandbag toss, right? You know, the whole thing about that is power, you know, triple extension of the hips, knees, and ankles and all that. But if I was teaching a CrossFit class, we could do a snatch, right? So the needs same, the how they vary is, you know, we're just looking at the same stimulus and then modifying to get that, you know, because why does it matter for somebody like the students we were working with earlier? Why does that matter to them? The snatch doesn't matter. Neither does a sandbag toss, but what matters is that triple extension or that jumping pattern, right? Because we do, to kind of go a little bit deeper on this, is like, as a human movement, where squat in nature?
When you're sitting down on a chair, when you're...
But if you're sitting down, like right now we're sitting, so technically it's a squat when we stand up, right? But when we're sitting, we're not active.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So where do we actually use that squat?
Jumping?
Yeah, so like jumping would be that's time. Jumping would be the only one. And when you jump, your hips never go below your knees, right? You would lose power if that were the case. So then you have to look at like, where does the squat below the knees serve you, right? Because that's where we're talking about difference between exercise in nature, but we do that in exercise. So understanding what the purpose of that and how you're going to use that, and like doing it correctly, right? Because if you understand what the movement pattern is, we won't talk about it now, but there's, you know, we have 2 types of muscle groups. You have internal torque muscles and you have external torque muscles. So which direction is the tension supposed to go based off of what you're doing in the phase of the squat, right? So we see a lot of like the same common injuries that happen over and over from people that do heavy barbell squatting. It's either their knees are wrecked or their lower back is wrecked. So if you look at that diagram and you know why the lower back is always activated, it's because there's a lot of development of the external torque muscles and not enough of the internal torque muscles. So there's an imbalance there from one side, ET to IT. But for us, like for our students, maybe that only comes into play as a skill. You know, we're teaching proprioception, body awareness. Maybe that's the reason to do a low ass to grass type squat.
Right.
Maybe mobility might be the reason.
Right.
And that way it keeps them safe.
Right.
We don't do a heavy loaded barbell squat because, you know, this is always going to happen. You know, the weight's never going to get heavy enough to build strength with that. So we're never really going to do a 1 rep, 3 rep, 5 rep max maybe. Maybe. Because there might be some students that could do it, you know. But for the majority of the neurodiverse that I've seen, it won't necessarily benefit them from that standpoint.
Right.
But,
so dealing with this, our community, how does then that play a role in finding their center? Because if they're not able to establish that heavy 1RM or, you know, the 3RM, then how do they find a true center which then they can build off of?
Yeah, we have to, first we have to know where their center is. You know what I mean? Because you look at the current level of functioning, the baseline, where they're at right now, you find out what they can, what they can't do, right? So you could take these movement patterns and test in different ways. You can have them carry things back and forth, you can have them move the object, you can have them press, throw the object, whatever it might be, and you'll start to find really fast what they don't have and what they do have. You know what I mean? From there, you can establish that baseline based off of those. So I think what people, when you're making that distinction between the testing and establishing a 1RM or things like that, it's like those are tests. It's not actually the center.
Right.
So yes, it's actually the extreme. So again, if you watch Julian's podcast, you'll know about the S curve, right? Is that the 1RM might be here, right? And this is like when you want, but it's not a test of your true strength. What it is a test of your overall like max capacity on your best day.
Right.
But the real test is what's right here. So basically what we're looking at is like, this is like Pareto's principle. It's the 80-20 rule. So you have the two extremes and then you have the center. So basically the way to kind of find out is not through just the one test. It's looking at the whole thing and over time figuring out where that center is and then trying to move that. So
you don't necessarily need to establish that 1RM to then be able to find that center and work with it.
I actually think that, let's say, to give you a good example, let's say you, since you've done CrossFit before, it should be that instead of going on a linear progression and finding out at the end what the test is, it should be on any given day, you walk into the gym and I say, get as heavy as you can.
Right.
Whether you slept good or not, or whether your day was stressful or not, like no matter what, that day you can lift that amount of weight, whatever that is. That is your center.
What's your 1 rep max? And I'm like, well, on a good day.
Yeah.
On the right perfect day, it's this much.
Right.
But on an average day, I can do this much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I think most of our training should be about. There's a balance between the two sides of the center and the extremes.
Right.
The same way that you have all these things. It's like, it's an arch upon an arch upon an arch upon an arch, and they all build on top of each other. And as a coach, that's mainly what we're looking at is, you know, where are those arches? You have the arch between the energy systems, you have the arch between the planes, you have the arch between this, and then you have the overall arch of homeostasis and hormesis, that relationship, and what is that result of?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So if you do something long enough, a ratio does appear. And then that's telling you, like, because you know you've trained long enough to know what stuff you like and what stuff you're like, I'm not showing up.
going that day.
I'm not showing up on run day.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So maybe this is where you need to work when your arch is over here And then you look deeper and you're like, well, yeah, I have been dealing with some anxiety and
Yeah.
sleep issues and stuff like that. Like, yeah, because you're heavily biased over here
Right.
and maybe not
Right.
using or consuming the lactate and stuff. We'll get to that stuff later, but
Yeah.
that's like, I think going back to the modification, the adaptation, and then, you know, all this stuff, it's all about finding that balance within the balance.
Right.
You know what I mean? So yeah, it's interesting. I think as we do it more and more, the center does start to appear.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, it's not like a 1RM test. It's like let's find out where you are and let's find your center with each passing session. And then we get a clear picture of where you are. I think, like for me, it'll take a good 3 to 6 months to find out where a student really is.
Right.
You know, sometimes, you know, we don't get there, but that's okay. But it's, to me, every day is like a test because there's so many ways to like express human movement that, and because exercise in some ways kind of gets in the way because the things that we move here are very recent. Like we haven't had them for a long time.
Right.
But our bodies, our nervous system has evolved over 300,000 years.
Yeah.
But we've only had barbells and these things for like 150 years.
Right.
So that's one thing that we always have to consider is that changes things. So going back to the squat, it's like, if we don't have it as a purpose to squat below the knees, but now all of a sudden we add an implement and then go, you know, it's not a bad thing. It has a purpose, but it changes things.
Yeah.
So you have to take the good with the bad.
Right.
You know, if you're going to do this all day long, then you got to be prepared for what's going to come, which is those injuries that
Right.
you see.
Right.
Because you do something long enough, a ratio will appear.
Yeah.
So if you go ET, 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 right? And there's no frontal plane, there's no, you know, it's weird. Like we don't see a lot of barbell rows in
No.
CrossFit, right?
No.
Like, so not a lot of frontal plane stuff and not a lot of like pulling towards you.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, yes, they do pull-ups so that we see the kipping stuff, but which has its own purpose. Like, I'm
Right.
not stating it good versus bad. It's just the ratio shows like over
Right.
time. Like, I bet you if I grab your traps, you
Yeah.
probably start screaming,
I
right?
learned how to do kipping pull-ups before I could even do a strict pull-up.
Right.
Like I skipped.
Oh,
right
how
to
is
the-
learning to do pull-ups with us?
It's hard. It's very hard.
It's super hard for women too because that engaging lat,
Right.
like, you know, men have bigger lats overall,
Right.
so to not want to default to the trap is
Right.
tough.
I think the first day we did it, I was like, "Am I even doing it? I don't even feel it. Am I doing it? Like, I don't know." Took a while to
so,
feel it.
Yeah,
And
it takes
understand
time. It takes a lot of time to. Also, if you've been in that like experience for a long time, you kind of learn to rely on the coach's feedback
Right.
to tell you how you feel.
Right. Oh, it looks good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
so,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julian calls that the dark side of the force.
Yeah.
Like make everybody look a certain way.
Yeah.
But it's like I have a client that I work with a couple mornings a week, and she'll always look at me like, "Am I doing it right?" You know, and I'm like, "I don't know. Are you
Right.
feeling it?"
Right.
Like,
Because everybody will look different.
Yeah.
And that's something I haven't necessarily learned before that I've learned here. That you don't have a cookie cutter position or
Yeah.
look. It's how does the athlete feel? Is there that
Right.
tension? Are
And
they
that-
creating the torque? Are
that's
they,
right.
you know?
you can observe that as a
Right.
coach. You can say, "Hey, here's what I see,"
Mm-hmm.
but if the athlete isn't feeling it, now you like brought up something that's like, how do we know when our kids can't communicate with us
Yeah.
whether they're feeling? That's
Yeah,
the
that
big.
was my next question.
Yeah, that's the big question because then we have to use our eyes as much as possible to see if and that's where the programming and how you do what you do makes all the difference because it's like, that's why I love sleds so much
Right.
because you can't really get away with
Right.
external torque while you're
Right.
trying to push a sled. You know what I mean? It's just not
hard.
going to work.
Yeah.
You're not going to move it, especially if I load it heavy enough to where
Yeah.
you really got to drive into it.
Right.
So it's one of those things that using those types of exercises help us, especially in the beginning, establish, you know, and the isometric stuff, because if you're holding something, you're going to squeeze it. You know what I mean? But in terms of like doing different types of movements, whether they are squats or deadlifts or things like that, you do kind of have to rely on your visual sense and go like, yeah, I see the tension of the femur going away from the belly button, so I know. But it's not like you can just tell the student, hey, you know, internal torque.
Yeah.
I mean, most people can't, you
Right.
know what I mean? You have to find really clever ways, like,
Right.
you know, feel this muscle here,
Right.
you know what I mean? And that's why I love things like the openers, like the obliques openers. You put the kettlebell down there and you
Oh yeah.
push, like you feel
Oh yeah.
everything
Yeah.
there. And so using those types of exercises to, I think for me, it's mostly like that feeling part of like, let me find different ways for you to connect to that torque chain. So I love like the diagram, because I could always go, he's not hinging, he's squatting. What can I do to make him squeeze that way?
Right.
You know, and then, all right, grab this book and squeeze it with your hands. Now bend down and, right? Now I can at least get it, some internal torque through the upper body or somewhere else where they might feel it more, and and then go at it from there, right? So,
It's a chain.
yeah, exactly. It's all connected.
Yeah.
So that's where, but the you know, they say something like, I'm probably gonna F this up, but they say that like 70% of your communication is nonverbal anyway.
Yeah. Something like
So
that. I've heard that.
it's probably not the right
Somewhere
number. So
around
don't
there.
kill me for not getting it right.
Right. The point
There's always
is,
gonna be somebody that's just
Yeah.
gonna, ooh,
the
whatever.
point is you communicate
Yes.
a lot non-verbally.
Right. So, I would say that those cues, if you want, or prompts, or whatever it might be, are the way to kind of figure that out. Because then you can communicate with the student and say, this is what I'm looking for.
Right.
I see that you're doing this, and you know, if you're comfortable in your lower back, that's why, kind of
Right.
thing, and say, try doing this, right? Or try squeezing this muscle, try squeezing this muscle, try, and doing different things. I think a lot of times coaches are afraid to like stop, slow down,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And
Right.
just like I've seen Richard through assessment stuff like spend the full hour on just this one thing, and by the end that athlete is like best session ever, even though all I did was and fight you the whole time, and then but it took that for them to finally get it.
Feel it and understand.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're always that objective thing always gets in the way, because you're like, oh, I got to do this and I got to do that and I gotta get that, and that's where I think, at least for me, and from what I've seen, is like that's where I think the system gets really effed up when it comes to CrossFit, is that we get so caught up in the task completion. Like we gotta go, we gotta finish the reps, we gotta do this,
Right.
and we forget about the intent.
Yeah.
Now you're supposed to come in here to feel good.
Right. And it's a disservice to the
Yeah.
athletes.
Well, over time, because
Yeah.
they're gonna get injured, or
Yeah.
their nervous system's gonna get effed up or something like
Yeah.
that. I know it sounds like I may be like, but I'm not. It's we have to do better.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And when after a while, like I've gone through it, like a lot of the anxiety issues that I was going through was because it was exercise induced. I didn't make it any better with my crazy life, but it did start there.
Right.
You know, it was like something triggered that all of a sudden, you know, I was in this place where I couldn't get out of this vicious circle of coming in here, killing myself, feeling like crap, and just trying to endure week to week to week.
Right.
And so it was, now when I understand, it's like I can set a constraint on a workout and go, I'm going to move like the way they originally intended. Mechanics, consistency, and then intensity.
Yeah.
So I can move my needle without, like, I'm still gonna die, but just not in a way that's gonna cause damage to the point where I can't work out anymore.
Right.
So I can I can do this workout nasal breathing and
Yeah.
push, you know what I mean? I can go lighter weight and, focus eccentric or isometric, right? And that way I'm focusing more on the tension versus the position,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
I can use a different implement, right? So instead of barbell pressing all the time, I can press that sandbag and
yeah.
create internal torque and things like that. It's just when you plug in that system into this, you see where things are missing and why.
Right.
And then we can do that same thing with our students is like, how are they mostly living their lives, or what's affecting them the most? Sedentarism. So if you're sitting for a long time, head forward, poor posture,
Right.
disengaged muscles, and this is why this is not to me like a squat, is that there's no tension here.
Right, right.
And you do that for a long time, then there's a ratio there.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of questions about, how do I increase muscle tone? Like, how about we use the muscles,
Right.
And we do balance this out, concentric, eccentric, isometric, right? You see where the imbalances are when it comes to that. Well, but we can't, the student doesn't move that well to begin with. Okay, so then we got to start there. We got to start with development.
Right.
Got to get them to do load, hold, and carry before we can get really precise with all this stuff, which is why I like the low west exercises, because there isn't that eccentric that's going to cause any damage.
Right.
And you could still load heavy, you could still create a good stimulus. You might even be able to get them into full strength because if they exert enough, right? But it's safe
Yeah.
because it's low in skill, low weight bearing in terms of the spine. So the barbell's not on their back or whatever. It's safe. It's safe on their joints.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Except for like the yoke carry, because
The new ones, the cool
Yeah.
ones that are.
I put those together. Just kidding. Yeah, those are to wobble inward. So I'm like trying to create like a bar that pushes against the side so that it doesn't,
Interesting.
so it only swivels. So
Yeah.
when you see that thing, don't say anything. I know already. I know that it's about the frontal. So yeah, I think a good place to start is to understand what movement is, what exercise is, and what you're doing over time creates a ratio, and then we figure out a balance.
Right.
You know what I mean? Is like if your kid doesn't have endurance or lacks muscle capacity, lacks muscle quantity, quality, all of that stuff, then we got to start somewhere. You know what I mean? And this is a good way to look at it and go, hey, what do they do mostly? And then where do we start? And then start finding out where their center is, and then start moving that center in some direction,
Kind of a case if you do have an athlete that's far on one side, do you focus only on the other side, or do you incorporate both?
So-
Do one more than
Yeah, so I think a lot of people mess that part up too when it comes, like, especially when I see like CrossFit programming and stuff, is that they bias, right? So they say, oh, we want strong guys. So, and you'll see it because you go to one box and it's like, man, they're so,
right.
you're so one way. And then you go to another box and it's usually the identity of the coach, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Absolutely.
oh, he's a gymnastics guy, so all their people are good at gymnastics,
Right.
which is fine if that's what you want to specialize in. I don't have a
Right.
problem with that. But I think people misunderstand that just because so the whole thing is like, if you specify or if you try to get good at this one thing, everything else is going to be forsaken.
Yeah.
So if you go strength bias
Right.
and you go really hard at this, like this is going to suffer.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So I think the ratio is, yes, there's extremes and then there's that middle part. So we have to find a balance within the balance as well. That, like, that's why we have our programming the way we have it. We have one BTQ session, right? Because how hard can you go that hard?
Yeah.
Or how many times can you do that? You have
Before
one
it just
BTQ,
becomes
you've had enough for the
pacing.
day. So like I did the 250 for the first time. was like, I never want to touch that thing for like another couple weeks, you know.
Right,
But
you're not going to do it the next day.
like I thought I was gonna go blind after I brought that back because my eyes were like popping out of my head.
Yeah.
But you need that every now and then.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not like we're gonna do that. If you do that over and over every day, you're gonna die for sure.
Right.
But if you're very passive and just, hey, I'm gonna go on my walks and that's it, that ratio will appear as well.
Right.
So it's not that you need everything equally, it's that you need everything to be within a certain degree of one another. We don't know what that is because everybody's different.
Yeah.
You know, I might have more strength bias versus your whatever.
Right.
So you might need something different than I would need.
Yeah.
And that's why if you guys have special fit way, that's why we're doing things the way we're doing them and focusing on smaller numbers, focusing on the private session or, you know, dyads and then small groups is that we want to be able to keep an eye on every student's progress and go, hey, your center's here, and we gotta figure that out. And you can't do that with massive numbers like that. But we do need that social piece. Everything's an arch.
Right.
You know, we need the social piece, we need the tribe, but we also need to be specific and individualized to a certain extent, you know? So I would say that we need everything to a certain degree.
Yeah, balance.
That's the answer.
Always. All right, I think that will wrap us up for today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like Facebook and Instagram. And thanks for watching. See you guys next time.